The rain fell gently outside, brushing against the window like a memory that refused to fade. Margaret Thompson sat on her living room couch, a soft blanket over her knees, flipping through an old photo album. The faint crackle of the fireplace filled the silence around her. At 62, she had grown used to quiet days like this, where the world seemed slower. And the only company she had was the soft ticking of the clock and the ghosts of her past. Her husband, Henry, had passed away 8 years ago. The pain had dulled over time, but it never truly left. She still found herself turning to tell him something during dinner or catching herself waiting for his footsteps in the hallway. Henry had been her anchor, kind, gentle, and steady, in a world that had often felt unpredictable. Losing him had been like losing part of herself. Margaret lived on the outskirts of Seattle, in a small cottage surrounded by pine trees. It was peaceful, sometimes too peaceful. Her daughter Laura visited every few weeks with her son, Ethan. But most of the time, Margaret's world was filled with long silences and echoes of old laughter. She had built a routine around her loneliness: morning tea, gardening, feeding the birds, and reading by the fire until it was time to sleep again. That Friday afternoon, as the rain thickened and gray clouds swallowed the sky, she expected company. Ethan, her 13-year-old grandson, had promised to stop by after school. He often came alone, preferring quiet afternoons with her to the noise of his friends' houses. Margaret adored his company. He reminded her of Henry in ways she couldn't quite explain: thoughtful, curious, always asking questions that made her think deeply. The sound of the front door creaking open pulled her from her thoughts. "Grandma." Ethan's voice carried warmth through the chilly air. "In here, sweetheart," she called out, closing the album halfway. He appeared in the doorway, damp from the rain, his blonde hair sticking to his forehead. His blue backpack hung loosely off one shoulder. "It's pouring out there," he said, grinning as he kicked off his sneakers. She smiled, gesturing toward the couch. "Sit down. I'll get you some hot chocolate." As she walked to the kitchen, she felt a simple joy in the act: the sound of the kettle boiling, the faint hum of the heater, the comforting sense of being needed again. Ethan sat cross-legged on the couch, noticing the open photo album. When she returned, he pointed toward one of the pictures. "Is that you and Grandpa?" She handed him the cup and looked down at the faded photo. Henry standing beside her at the beach, his arm around her shoulder, both of them laughing as the wind tangled her hair. "Yes," she said softly. "That was a long time ago. We were just about your age when we met." Ethan studied the photo. "You look really happy." Margaret nodded, her smile faint but sincere. We were poor, but we had dreams. That was enough for us. Do you still miss him?" he asked, his tone careful, almost adult. She hesitated. The question shouldn't have hurt, but it did. "Every single day," she admitted. "Some days I miss his voice. Other days it's just the sound of him moving around the house. You get used to someone's presence, and when they're gone, the quiet feels too big." Ethan looked thoughtful. "Mom says you should try to meet someone new. She says you spend too much time alone." Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. "Your mother worries too much." "I don't think that's for me." "But why not?" he pressed. She leaned back, watching the rain streak down the window. "Because love isn't something you replace, Ethan. It's something you carry. Even if someone new comes along, it's never the same kind of love." He nodded slowly, processing her words. "I think Grandpa would still want you to be happy." Her throat tightened. "Maybe, but happiness looks different for everyone." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire dance across the wood. Margaret thought about the years that had passed, how quickly they'd gone, how much had changed. The world outside her home moved fast, but her days had become measured, predictable. And though she told herself she was content, something inside her longed for more. Not romance, not excitement, but connection. After an hour, Ethan stood up, finishing his drink. "Mom's picking me up in 20 minutes, he said, glancing at his watch. "Can I take this picture of you and Grandpa? I want to show it to her." "Of course, sweetheart," she said, sliding the photo carefully out of its plastic cover. "Keep it safe." As he left, Margaret stood by the door, waving until his mother's car disappeared down the road. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of it, fresh and earthy. She turned back toward the house and sighed. Without Ethan's laughter, the silence felt sharper again. That night, she made herself a simple dinner and sat by the window, watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement. Across the street, she saw her neighbor, Tom Reynolds, walking his dog. He was around her age, widowed, quiet, always polite. They had spoken a few times over the years, exchanged short hellos. But never more than that. As he looked up and waved, she hesitated for a second before waving back. For a brief moment, she thought about how different her evenings might be if she let someone in again. The thought unsettled her. She didn't want to replace Henry. She just didn't want to feel so alone. Later that night, as she got ready for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the young, carefree girl from the photo. But there was still warmth in her eyes, a quiet kind of strength that had carried her through loss and years of solitude. She turned off the light, but her mind stayed awake. She kept hearing Ethan's words. "I think Grandpa would still want you to be happy." It was such a simple statement, yet it lingered. What if happiness wasn't just about memories or the past? What if it was something she could still find in small, unexpected ways? The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds, bright and golden. Margaret walked outside to collect her mail, breathing in the crisp air. As she reached the mailbox, she noticed a letter tucked between the usual bills and ads. It was addressed in neat handwriting she didn't recognize. Curious. She opened it on the porch. It was from David Collins, a name she hadn't heard in nearly 40 years. David had been her first love. Long before Henry, they had met in high school. Inseparable for 2 years, before life took them in different directions. He had moved away, and she had eventually met Henry. She hadn't thought of him in years, not seriously. At least the letter was short, written in a tone that was both warm and uncertain. He had found her address through an old mutual friend. He mentioned that he had recently lost his wife and had thought of her not to rekindle anything, but to reconnect, to talk, to share memories. Margaret folded the letter slowly, her heart beating faster than she expected. She walked back inside and placed it on the coffee table, staring at it as though it might vanish if she blinked. She felt conflicted, surprised, nervous, but also something else. A faint spark that she hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan's voice echoed in her mind. Again, maybe he'd still want you to be happy. Margaret took a deep breath, looking toward the phone. Her hand hovered over it, trembling slightly. Then she whispered to herself, maybe it's time to stop living in memories. And with that, she reached for the phone, but before she could dial, it rang the screen, flashing a number she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped a beat. Margaret froze as the phone continued to ring. The sound echoed through the quiet room, pulling her out of her hesitation. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen. The number wasn't saved, but something inside her whispered that she already knew who it might be. Her heart thumped faster, her breath catching. Finally, she picked up, "Hello?" Her voice came out softer than she intended. There was a pause. A faint sound of breathing, and then a voice she hadn't heard in 40 years. Gentle. Lower now, but unmistakably familiar. "Margaret, it's David Collins." Her knees almost gave way. She sank into the nearest chair, pressing a hand to her chest. "David, I just got your letter." He chuckled quietly. "I was hoping it reached you. I wasn't sure if you'd even remember me after all this time." "Remember you?" she said, a faint smile forming. "You were impossible to forget." He laughed softly, and for a moment she was 17 again, sitting in his old blue truck, singing along to the radio with the windows down. But the years between them felt heavy too. Years of love, loss, and life that neither could undo. They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily. He told her about his life after leaving Seattle, the move to California, his long marriage to a teacher named Grace, his 2 children who now lived far away. When he spoke about Grace's passing, his voice wavered, and Margaret felt a deep empathy she didn't expect. She shared her own story, how Henry had filled her years with laughter and steadiness, and how lonely the world had become after he was gone. At one point there was silence. Then David said softly, "I didn't write to stir old memories. I wanted to hear a familiar voice again. Someone who remembers who I used to be. Understand," she said, her throat tightening. "We all want to be remembered for more than who we became. I promise to talk again soon." When the call ended, Margaret sat there in the dim light, the phone still warm in her hand. The rain had stopped outside, and a single beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, landing on the table. She stared at it for a long time, realizing she hadn't felt this alive in years. Over the next few weeks, their calls became frequent. Sometimes short, sometimes long, but always comforting. They spoke about the past, but also about the small details of their present lives. What books they were reading. What music they still loved. He told her he'd taken up painting since retirement, and she teased him about it. "You couldn't even draw a straight line in school," she laughed. "I still can't," he replied. "But now I don't care if the lines are crooked." One Sunday evening, as she was preparing tea, the phone rang again. His voice came through cheerful this time. "I'm going to be in Seattle next week," he said. "My daughter's moving here for work. I'd love to see you if you're comfortable with that." Margaret froze. The thought of seeing him again face to face after 4 decades filled her with a strange mix of excitement and fear. I don't know," she said softly. "Just lunch," he assured. "Old friends catching up." Her heart said yes, but her nerves screamed no. Still, by the end of the call, she had agreed. "All right, David, lunch." For the next few days, she could think of little else. She went through her closet, unsure what to wear, laughing at herself for caring so much. She even visited her hairdresser for the first time in months, asking for something simple but neat. The day came, bright and cold, sunlight reflecting off wet streets. David had suggested a small cafe downtown, one that overlooked the bay. When she arrived, her hands trembled slightly as she held her purse, and then she saw him. He was sitting by the window, a gray coat folded neatly over the chair beside him. His hair was mostly silver now, his face lined, but his eyes, those same gentle brown eyes, hadn't changed. When he looked up and smiled, it was like time folded in on itself. "Margaret," he said warmly as he stood. "David." Her voice broke slightly, but her smile didn't. They hugged, a brief, uncertain hug that carried years of unspoken emotion. When they sat, he said softly, "You look exactly how I remembered. Just wiser." She laughed. "That's a kind way to say older." They talked for hours, barely noticing their food. It felt natural, effortless, as if no time had passed at all. He told stories about his late wife with affection, and Margaret listened, touched by his sincerity. She spoke of Henry, too. And together they reflected on the strange way love could stay even after people were gone. At one point, David leaned back and looked at her quietly. "You know, it's funny. When we were young, I thought I'd never love anyone like I loved you. And then life showed me love could change shape. Now, sitting here, I realize it never really disappeared. It just waited." Margaret felt her heart twist. She didn't know what to say. "That's a beautiful thought," she finally whispered. After lunch, they walked along the waterfront. The air was crisp, and seagulls cried overhead. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: lightness. She noticed small things: the sparkle of sunlight on the waves, the warmth of his presence beside her. When it was time to part, he asked gently, "May I see you again?" She hesitated, but her smile gave her away. "Yes, I'd like that." That evening, as she returned home, Ethan called to check in. "How was your day, Grandma?" he asked, his voice cheerful. "It was nice," she said softly. "Different. What did you do?" "Oh, just met an old friend," she said with a quiet smile. He laughed. "See, Mom was right. You do need to get out more." After the call, she sat by the fire, thinking about what he'd said. Maybe he was right. Maybe she'd spent too long hiding behind old memories, afraid to live again. Over the next month, she and David met often, at the park, at the cafe, sometimes even for quiet dinners. Their friendship deepened in a way that felt both new and familiar. They didn't rush anything. They didn't need to. It was the comfort of two souls who had both known love and loss, finding peace in each other's company. But one afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking the bay, David grew quiet. "Margaret," he began, "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I need to tell you something." She turned to him, her expression open. "What is it?" "I've spent years missing someone I couldn't get back," he said. "And for the first time in a long while, I don't feel that ache. You've brought something back into my life I thought was gone forever." She felt a lump form in her throat. David eyed before she could finish. He smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." For the rest of the evening, they sat in silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and violet. When she returned home later that night, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. She felt both grateful and frightened. Grateful to feel alive again. Frightened of what it might mean. She pulled out the old photo of her and Henry, still sitting in its frame by the mantel. She traced the edges with her finger, whispering softly, "You'd want me to be happy, wouldn't you?" The room stayed silent, but something in her heart answered yes. The next morning, she woke up to find a message from David. "I'm leaving for California for a few weeks. My daughter needs help settling in. When I'm back, I'd love to see you again. Take care of yourself, Em." She read it twice, smiling to herself. For the first time in years, she had something to look forward to. But life, she knew, had a way of changing faster than the heart could keep up. And when Ethan came over later that week, asking her an innocent question, it would stir emotions she thought she had buried long ago. Because sometimes, love isn't just about finding someone again, it's about learning what to let go of. A week after David's message, the house felt quiet again. Margaret returned to her slow morning's tea by the window, letters on the kitchen counter, the steady hum of solitude she had once called peace. But this time, it felt different. The silence wasn't painful, but thoughtful, like her life was holding its breath, waiting for something new. She often found herself thinking about David, his laughter, the warmth in his eyes, the way he made her feel visible again. Yet she also thought of Henry. There was a guilt that lingered, quiet but persistent, as though moving forward meant leaving something sacred behind. On a bright Saturday morning, the sound of a car pulling into her driveway broke her thoughts. She stepped out onto the porch just as Ethan jumped out of the passenger seat. Laura, her daughter, waved from the car window. "He begged to spend the day with you," she called out, smiling. Margaret laughed. "He's always welcome." Ethan ran up and hugged her tightly. "Mom's going shopping. I wanted to come here instead." "Well, I'm glad you did," Margaret said, guiding him inside. The day was calm and filled with small moments, baking cookies, tending to her garden, and reading aloud from one of Ethan's favorite books. But as the afternoon light began to fade, something about the stillness made him curious. He looked around, his young mind picking up on details adults often ignored. "Grandma," he said suddenly, "you've been smiling more lately." She froze, surprised. "Have I?" "Yeah," he said confidently. Even Mom noticed. "She said you've been different lately, happier." Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." Ethan leaned closer, his tone innocent but probing. "Is it because of that man who wrote to you? The one you told Mom about?" She blinked, a little taken aback. "You know about that?" "Mom mentioned it once," he said quickly. "She said an old friend reached out to you. Is he nice?" "He's kind," she said softly. "He's someone from a long time ago." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Like before Grandpa?" "Yes," she whispered. "Long before." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Do you like him?" The question caught her completely off guard. She laughed nervously, trying to deflect. "Oh, Ethan, it's not like that. We're just friends." But Ethan wasn't convinced. "You look different when you talk about him. You sound happy." Margaret looked at him, unsure how to respond. How could she explain to a 13-year-old that happiness, at her age, didn't always mean love? Sometimes it simply meant being seen again. She sat beside him and said quietly, "When you get older, you'll understand that life isn't always about starting over. Sometimes it's just about remembering who you were and finding a bit of that person again." He nodded slowly, but then asked something that made her heart stop. "Grandpa wouldn't be mad, right?" Her throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said gently, "if you like someone again, Grandpa wouldn't be mad, would he?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The question was innocent, but it pierced deep. For years she had carried the unspoken guilt that loving again, even a little, might somehow betray Henry's memory. Hearing those words from Ethan felt like permission she hadn't realized she needed. She swallowed hard and smiled through her tears. "No, sweetheart. Grandpa wouldn't be mad. He'd just want me to be happy." Ethan smiled, satisfied. "Then you should be." That night, after he fell asleep on the couch watching an old movie, Margaret sat by the fire thinking about the simplicity of that statement. You should be happy. She looked around her quiet home, the framed photos, the bookshelves, the faint smell of cookies still in the air, and realized that her life wasn't ending with age. It was still unfolding, still offering chances to feel, to grow, to love. A week later, David returned from California. He called her the next morning. "I'm back," he said warmly. "How have you been?" "I've been thinking," she said, smiling. "About what?" "About what it means to let life in again." He was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe we could talk about it over dinner." This time she didn't hesitate. "I'd like that." They met at the same cafe by the bay. The air was crisp, the water calm, and as they sat together, Margaret felt that same quiet excitement rise again. Not the rush of youth, but the steady warmth of connection. David reached across the table, his hand brushing hers gently. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "I just enjoy being near you, talking to you. It feels right." Margaret nodded, her heart full. "It does." They didn't need to say much after that. The silence between them was comfortable, alive. When they walked along the pier later, he told her about his plans to move back to Seattle permanently, to be closer to his daughter, and quietly. To her, the idea of having someone nearby again filled her with both joy and fear. But she no longer felt like she had to choose between the past and the future. She could carry both. As the weeks passed, Margaret and David's friendship deepened. They didn't rush into anything romantic. It was more about companionship, laughter, and understanding. They took walks, shared meals, and even attended a small community concert together. People in town began to notice, and Margaret didn't mind. One afternoon, Laura stopped by unexpectedly. She saw David leaving just as she arrived. "Was that David Collins?" she asked, eyes wide. Margaret nodded calmly. "Yes, he came by for tea." Laura hesitated. "You've been seeing him often, haven't you?" "I have," Margaret admitted. Laura looked concerned. "Mom, are you sure you're ready for that? I mean, after Dad?" Margaret stopped her gently. "Laura, I'll never stop loving your father. But love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just changes form. David isn't replacing him. He's reminding me that I'm still alive." Laura stared at her mother for a long moment, then smiled softly. "You sound happier than I've heard you in years." "I am," Margaret said simply. That evening when Ethan called again, he said something that made her heart swell. "Mom says you're smiling more again." I told her I knew why. "Oh, really?" she teased. "And what did you tell her?" "I said Grandpa would be proud." Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were warm. "I think you're right." Months passed and the seasons began to change. David moved to Seattle just as he'd planned. Their friendship turned into something quiet but certain. A second chance at companionship, built not on youth or passion, but on understanding and shared history. One summer evening, the whole family gathered for dinner at Margaret's home. David came too, helping her set the table. Laura and Ethan welcomed him kindly, and for the first time, Margaret felt complete, surrounded by love from the past and the present. During dessert, Ethan leaned over and whispered, "See? You're happy now." Margaret laughed softly. "Yes, I am." That night, after everyone left, she stood by the window watching the stars shimmer over the quiet street. She thought of Henry, his laugh, his kindness, his memory, and felt no guilt anymore. Like gratitude, she whispered softly, "Thank you for the life we had, and for giving me the courage to live again." Then she looked toward the photo on the mantel and smiled in her heart. She knew Henry would have understood. Life had not given her one great love. It had given her two, one that taught her how to love, and one that reminded her how to live. And every time she heard Ethan's voice in her memory saying, "Grandpa wouldn't be mad, right?" she smiled through tears, knowing that love in its purest form never fades. It simply changes hands.